The sun dipped low across the Montana plains, painting the horizon in strokes of gold and fire. Thomas Hale leaned against the rail of his weathered porch, his rough hands gripping the wood like it was the only thing keeping him steady. His ranch stretched endlessly around him, wild horses grazing in the distance, pastures rolling into shadow, and silence heavy as a stone. For years, that silence had been his closest companion. But today was different. Today, he was waiting. Thomas had scrubbed his boots until they shone, combed his hair back until it sat flat and awkward, and put on a shirt with buttons instead of the usual work-worn flannel. His heart thumped nervously in his chest. It had been more than a decade since he had waited for anyone. He was 42, a man hardened by loss, work, and the loneliness of the land. But even the hardest ground, he had come to realize, longed for rain. So, in a moment of quiet courage, he had written letters, signed papers, and placed his hope in something he once would have laughed at, ordering a bride through an agency. He imagined her as gentle, perhaps soft-spoken, maybe even timid. A woman who might light a lamp in his dim kitchen, whose laughter would warm the silence of the ranch house. A partner. Someone who might heal the wound of years spent alone. When the stagecoach came rattling down the dusty road, Thomas's heart lifted like it hadn't in years. The driver cracked his whip, dust swirled, and the door swung open. A figure stepped down. But she was not the woman Thomas had been expecting. A young Chinese woman, small in stature, her black hair tied back in a neat braid, clutched a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Her dark eyes scanned the open land nervously. She looked too fragile for such an unforgiving place, too foreign to belong. And when her gaze met Thomas's, she lowered her head quickly, as though bracing for judgment. The driver tipped his hat. "Here she is, Mr. Hale. Paper says she's your bride." Thomas blinked, stunned. "There's been a mistake." "No mistake I can see," the driver said, handing him a folded document. "Name's written clear. Agency sent her. My job's done." He tipped his hat again and the stagecoach rattled away, leaving only the sound of hooves fading into silence. Thomas stood frozen, staring at the stranger. She said something in a stream of Chinese words, her tone soft but desperate. He couldn't understand a single syllable. But her eyes told the story, fear, hope, and exhaustion. Thomas exhaled slowly. His dream of a mail-order bride who would speak his tongue and laugh at his jokes was gone. Instead, he was left with this woman, who stood shivering in the Montana wind with no place to go. And something in him, some quiet corner that still remembered kindness, whispered. Don't send her away. Her name, he would soon learn, was Mei Lin. He discovered it by pointing at himself and saying, Thomas, and then pointing at her. She pressed her hand against her chest and whispered, Mei Lin. Those first days were clumsy, filled with silence broken by hand gestures and awkward attempts to communicate. She moved through the house like a shadow, careful not to intrude, folding blankets, scrubbing the table, boiling water for tea as though trying to earn her place. Thomas found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. The way her hands moved gracefully, the way her eyes softened when she gazed out the window at the horses. There was a quiet dignity about her, as though she carried stories he would never hear. One night, he found her standing by the barn, staring up at the stars. Her lips moved in whispered Chinese words. Prayers, perhaps. He stepped closer, and she turned, startled. For a moment, he saw the loneliness in her eyes. The same loneliness that had haunted him for years. It struck him then, though they were worlds apart in language and culture, they were bound by the same hunger for belonging. Life on the ranch was not easy for Mei Lin. She burned her hands on hot pans, confused by the iron stove. She startled at the neigh of horses and refused to go near the cattle. Once, Thomas returned from the fields to find her sitting on the floor, crying silently, holding a broken ceramic plate. She tried to speak, shaking her head, gesturing wildly, but all he could do was kneel beside her. Without words, he took the broken pieces from her trembling hands and set them aside. Then, gently, he touched her shoulder. "It's all right," he said softly, though she could not understand. "It's just a plate." She looked at him with wide eyes, and though the words were lost between them, something deeper passed through, a flicker of trust. Days stretched into weeks. Slowly, Mei Lin learned small English words. Water, bread, horse. She would repeat them after Thomas, her accent lilting, her determination fierce. Sometimes, she would laugh when she mispronounced something, and that sound, the fragile, melodic laugh, filled the house with warmth Thomas hadn't known in years. And Thomas, in turn, learned to listen beyond words. To see meaning in the tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, the way she lingered by the window when rain fell. One afternoon, a storm swept across the plains, fierce and sudden. Thomas had been out driving cattle when lightning cracked the sky. His horse spooked, throwing him to the ground. Pain shot through his leg, sharp and blinding. He dragged himself under a tree as rain poured, his vision blurring. Hours later, Mei Lin found him. She had braved the storm alone, her clothes drenched, her braid undone, her small frame trembling with cold. She knelt beside him, her hands fluttering with panic before she pressed them firmly against his wound. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. It was the first time she had said his name with such clarity. She half dragged, half carried him back to the house. All night, she tended his wound, changing cloths, whispering prayers in Chinese. Her hands never left him. When pain jolted him awake, he saw her sitting at his bedside, eyes heavy but determined, refusing to leave. And in those hours, Thomas realized something he hadn't dared admit: this woman, who had arrived a stranger, had already given him more care and devotion than anyone in years. Weeks passed. Thomas healed slowly, leaning on a cane. Mei Lin grew bolder, managing the kitchen, feeding animals, even attempting broken English conversations. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Thomas found her in the garden, her hands covered in soil as she planted herbs. He stood quietly, watching her hum a tune in her native tongue. Something swelled in his chest. A mix of gratitude, admiration, and a tenderness he had thought long dead. "Mei Lin," he said softly. She looked up, her cheeks flushed. He struggled for words. Finally, he touched his chest. "Home." Then, pointing at her, he whispered, "You, home." Her eyes shimmered with tears. She didn't answer in English. Instead, she pressed her hand against his chest, right over his heart, and whispered something in Chinese. He didn't need a translation. In that moment, Thomas realized love didn't require a shared language, it required presence, kindness, and courage. Seasons turned. The ranch, once filled with silence, now echoed with laughter, music, and the rhythm of two people building a life together. Mei Lin's English grew stronger, Thomas picked up fragments of Chinese. Their conversations were a patchwork of words, gestures, and heart. Neighbors who once scoffed at the idea of a mail-order bride began to admire the quiet strength of their bond. Some even envied it. For Thomas and Mei Lin had forged something rare, not born of perfect compatibility, but of patience, sacrifice, and the shared desire to not be alone. Years later, Thomas would look back on that day at the porch, the day the stagecoach brought not the bride he expected, but the wife he needed. And he would thank the heavens for the mistake that gave him Mei Lin. Because sometimes, love doesn't arrive in the form we imagine. Sometimes, it arrives as a stranger who doesn't speak our language, but who speaks directly to our soul.